Welcome back to another episode of The State of Sustainability. This episode is a little different. We're trialing Content Bytes, where we share short-form insights on what's new and what's topical in the sustainability space. So this episode is a little different, in some ways a little drier, but we're going to try and spice it up. We're going to talk about regulation, which, as anyone who knows me, is one of my least favorite topics in the world, despite being in a software company that it focuses on making regulation easier to comply with. Specifically, we're going to talk about the UK's shift from SECR reporting, or Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, SECR, towards the new UK sustainability reporting standards. This is a story that has been in the making for a few years. The new UK SRS is not yet in force. It'll be in force expected next year, but it is out for consultation now. And so what we're going to talk about in this episode is a bit of the background and a bit of the context, like what are these standards? Why are we interested in them? Why is the UK interested in streamlining them and putting them together and kind of replacing one with the other, etc.? But what we're not going to do is we're not simply going to summarize what's in the new standards or what's in the old standards, because frankly, you can get that online more easily. Instead, what we're going to focus on is what we think are the interesting shifts that this will catalyze, what we think this means, and where we think this is heading. And so this is a little more of a qualitative take rather than simply just a Spark Notes version of the regulation. That said, let's go a little into the history of both. And so with SECR, or the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, I'm just going to call it SECR from now on. SECR basically has its origins in the UK's early attempts to measure carbon usage. And going back to, let's say, the early 2010s, the UK sort of assumed carbon usage for the UK is really basically scope 1 and 2 type stuff, which means it's really utility use. And so SECR is really oriented primarily around energy use for businesses with, basically a side of carbon. And the goal was to make it easier for the UK to meet its own emissions targets as a country by sort of passing the buck down to businesses in a reasonably simple, reasonably straightforward standard for how you could kind of measure and report this, with obviously a set of thresholds for which companies should be on the hook for this. And that was good and valid for a while. What changed then was at the Glasgow COP, there was a movement to have a global standard for measuring and reporting climate-related risks and exposure. And that was the IFRS, particularly S1 and S2, which oriented around what is the sort of impact that your business has on the world from a climate and sustainability perspective, and also what is the impact that the world has on your business. The UK obviously hosted that COP, and so was a big backer of the new standards. But then the UK decided, actually, we want to sort of have our own version of this that is very much aligned with IFRS, but we're going to sort of have some changes, some adjustments, and we're then going to incorporate it into UK legislation and UK rules. It may seem quite strange that the UK decided to do this. And there are a couple of reasons for why it made sense for the UK to say, great, we've got a global standard, now we're just going to do our own version. And I think actually there are two logics at play here. One is, for those that are familiar with UK jurisprudence, or let's say just UK public law, there's a long-standing tradition where the UK doesn't want to be governed by other people's rules. Even when the UK has had a role in shaping them, the UK typically does not want to take some other legal system externally and apply it to the UK. And that's for reasons of a word that is more well-known than it should be, which is sovereignty. The UK cares a bizarrely inordinate amount about sovereignty, which means that the UK wants to say, if we're going to abide by this, we're going to set the rule ourselves, even if it matches largely an external rule. And actually, the UK has done this for human rights as well, where the Human Rights Act in the UK basically just took European standards and said, we're literally going to take this more or less on a one-for-one basis, but we're going to pass it locally as our own law and kind of make it work here. And the UK is sort of doing the same thing here as well, which is the UK is saying, great, there's a global standard, we like it, we're going to largely do the same thing, but we're going to make some small tweaks and adjustments so that it feels like our own rules, basically, and we don't seem to look beholden to an external body or an external system. But that said, we're going to align it very closely with IFRS, we're going to align it very closely with ISSB, and therefore it's not going to be onerous, it's not going to be an additional heavy lift for businesses versus what they might have to do globally. The other reason, which I think is more interesting actually, is that the UK has for several years now cherished the idea that it is going to become a powerhouse for the green economy. And that is less talked about now, but bear in mind that legislation takes several years to reach the point where it's out in the public space. So actually, the UK sustainability reporting standards have been in the works for a few years now. And, a few years ago, for those who kind of go back to, let's say, the Boris Johnson government and, frankly, the Theresa May government and a lot of the previous governments, I lose track of how many Conservative prime ministers there were in a row. There was a big focus on the green economy and how actually net zero was going to create a whole new world of jobs for the UK and actually enable a whole export industry for the UK. And what the UK does best from an export perspective is not cars, despite what the government would have you believe, it's services. The UK's big export industry is professional services, banking, law, accountancy, audit, etc. And the real catalyst for services, the thing that really gets services going, is a whole new standard that actually creates a lot of service work for everyone to do. And so by actually defining this new standard and trying to take the lead in making IFRS standards applicable and put them into practice for business, the UK believes that it is helping to shape the terrain for services and the services economy to operate, which means that UK law firms, UK accountancy firms, UK banks all have a bit of a head start in helping shape the standard, in helping bring it into practice, and helping position as experts globally. I'm sounding maybe a little more authoritative than I intend and a little more cynical than I intend. This is simply my take on what I'm sort of stringing together from having observed the space for a few years. I think that is ultimately super interesting actually for the UK economy because I actually think there's a lot of truth in it. I think that helping shape standards does help catalyze this sort of new industry that the UK is trying to create. Ultimately, I do think that that's a really good thing for the sustainability transition as well. We need service providers who know what they're talking about. And the best thing to help service providers know what they're talking about is to play a role in shaping the rules. And the new UK sustainability reporting standards are out for consultation as we speak. Now, let's talk a little bit about what shifts. And there are a number of shifts. I'm not going to go into them in too much detail. And by shift, I mean something that was true for SECR and is changed a little in the new standards. And so a few things are that the scope is more forward-looking. And so if you look at SECR is mostly about historical usage and intensity. SECR is mostly interested in how much energy did you use, how much carbon was emitted, tell me what this looked like over previous times. It is not a super qualitative standard. Whereas if you look at the new standards are actually very significantly about the future. They're talking about, okay, tell me about risks going forward. Risks are almost always future-based, right? It's like there's a risk that this will happen in my business by virtue of changing climate and the impact that climate change might have on my supply chain. Tell me about opportunities. What do you think is an opportunity area for your business as well? Tell me about your transition plans. Tell me about what you're doing to make these things real. There's also a big shift around actually trying to align this stuff with financial reporting. And so that's one area where the new UK standards are different to the IFRS and ISSB standards, where it sort of removed the grace period, allowing you to defer climate reporting a little versus your financial reporting cadence. And so the UK standards require you to kind of disclose them together. And what the UK believes is that dovetailing these, or dovetailing is a word that my first boss really loved and stuck in my head since then. But the UK believes that sort of joining these things together actually will make it easier for business. I actually think it also makes it easier for auditors and accountancy firms also to collaborate with their clients on getting these pieces of reporting, financial and non-financial, out together. And I think that plays into my thesis that this is partly intended to really catalyze the professional services industry in the UK. Another area of shift is that the new standards are very interested in what your management structures are and organizationally, and from a governance perspective, what are you doing to put in place mechanisms to manage the risks and capitalize on the opportunities that we're talking about. There's a much heavier burden on data and data disclosure and KPIs and metrics. And so data systems that would have been good enough for SECR are unlikely to be good enough for the new standards. Scope 3 was largely ignored by utilize SECR. It was kind of encouraged, but basically not required. Whereas in the new standards, there's a expectation that Scope 3 actually does get phased in and starts being reported on in general by all companies covered by the standards. And crucially, and again, this is another one that feeds into my little thesis on professional services, there's a big emphasis on assurance requirements for your disclosures according to the new standards. So the UK is basically creating demand for assurance services within this. I don't mean to suggest that literally the only goal of this is to create jobs for PwC and the like, but I think that there is a nice synergy between what the UK wants to achieve here, where the UK has been remarkably consistent in sticking to its sustainability goals as a country. There's been a lot of opposition to it, but so far the UK is holding reasonably firm. The UK also does want to create jobs and wants to create an economic opportunity, and the UK does want to actually be governed primarily by UK legislation as far as that can be the case, rather than be beholden to a foreign standard. What I think this does for business, I think there's going to be a number of really interesting shifts or transitions that this requires for companies that are now looking to comply. For most companies that have been used to reporting against SECR, this has been, I'm sure it was painful when it first started happening, but it just was absorbed into the regular course of business. There's someone in every business that is on the hook for SECR who is doing this. They're compiling a report, they're getting it over the fence, they're forgetting about it probably when it's done. Whereas when you start getting into this whole risk and opportunity and materiality space, you're now actually forcing the business to start sort of introspecting, but really thinking strategically about what the impact means. Everyone tends to be quite careful when they're providing something to their regulator, when they're providing something to the government. They want it to be reasonably true to the best of their understanding and ability, because they're afraid of legal risk and liability as a result of, let's say, negligence, which means that every business will start thinking about what those risks are and start thinking about what those opportunities are. Maybe that's going to be at a superficial level. Maybe they'll just sort of take a templatized approach. But I think actually a great number of businesses will start scrutinizing these topics in ways that they haven't done before. Another big shift, which I think is going to be interesting, is this sort of joining together of finance and non-finance from a disclosure perspective. We were already seeing this trend happening, and I think this is just going to accelerate that trend. What I mean by that is that finance teams are most likely going to be entrenched in the lead when it comes to disclosure reporting, because it will just increasingly make sense. I think the logical step for businesses to say, we are going to most likely use one set of assurance partners, as far as we can across all our assurance needs. We're going to try and leverage the same sorts of data systems as far as we can take them. And we're going to try and leverage the same sorts of data controllers within our business as far as we can take them. And most likely those controllers will sit within the finance function. And so I think this actually puts a lot of gas on the momentum that was already there in finance teams coming to the lead. I think another piece that is going to be really helpful for the sustainability transition is that Scope 3 is going to be much more front and center. And so, 3 years ago, if you were talking to even a large UK business, let's say, maybe it's a more traditional or a family-owned business, might be doing a few £100 million of revenue plus minus, they would probably not know what Scope 3 is. They would probably not think about it. It would not be something on their radar, but they would know what their SECR reporting obligations are. Whereas now Scope 3 is going to come much more into the fore. And as it becomes much more common parlance or common practice, I think that will really catalyze better mechanisms to measure it and manage it and drive it forward and collaborate with other companies as well. So overall, I'm quite bullish on the impact that these standards might have. I think it's also generally a good thing to start aligning standards together, even if you're kind of calling them different things and having domestic legislation that is like a doppelganger or a duplication of the global standard. I think it's fine, as long as there is good alignment and actually there isn't a massive push to do many different things for many different masters. So the other piece that I'm excited to see is what change this creates for business and how businesses start operating differently, particularly here in the UK. And the third big shift that I am actually really excited, and I have a vested interest in this, of course, is to see what this does from a green economy perspective and how this sort of how professional services firms and software companies like ours at Altruistiq rise to the, I was going to say challenge, but I would really say opportunity that the UK is providing for us to not just, work with more businesses and do more great stuff in terms of catalyzing change, but also, frankly, just help lead from a thought leadership perspective, from an information perspective on the global stage by being quite front and center of setting standards and guidelines. So that's my hot take on the new regulations and standards. Like I said, I don't normally talk about standards and legislation. If you enjoyed this, please find me on LinkedIn, drop me a message, ask me to do more of these, and I will. Thanks very much for listening to this edition of the State of Sustainability podcast. Please hit follow or subscribe so you get notified as soon as our next episode drops.